This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Groomed to Die, the Kendzia Children, the first ever Suffer the Little Children podcast miniseries. I'm your host, Laine, and this is part 3, Shannon. In the first 2 episodes of this miniseries, I told you about the deaths of 2 baby boys who were adopted and died within 9 months of each other. I also told you about the subsequent murder trial of their adoptive mother, Susan Kendzia, who was acquitted of Michael's murder and never tried for Kevin's. In this episode, I will tell you about another child who endured years of abuse and torture at Susan's hands, a chronically ill child whose sickness was never investigated after her baby brothers died, even though Munchausen by proxy was brought up at Susan's trial. This is part 3, Shannon. I'd like to give a quick shout out to my newest patrons, Kayla B. from Killeen, Texas, Diana M. from Foxton Beach, New Zealand, and Brianne L. from East Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you all so much for your support, which helps me to keep making this podcast. If you'd like to help keep the show going, you can make a pledge at patreon.com/stlcpod or contribute at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Thank you again. By early 1980, Susan and Doug Cook, both 20 years old, had already welcomed their first child, Christy, and were expecting their second. As I mentioned in part 1, Susan had always wanted a son. In one of their recorded phone calls, Susan's attorney, Kenneth Usner, said,
"She has had such a burning desire all of her life to have a son. She wants to go to basketball games. She wants to see the kid excel in football and baseball. My client is really athletically inclined, and she's always wanted a son. This burning desire to have a baby."
With each of her 2 biological children, Susan prepared to have a boy and was disappointed when she was blessed with 2 daughters. Because Susan had a tendency to document events in her life in writing, we have access to her perspective on a lot of these events that we otherwise wouldn't have. She is, however, the epitome of an unreliable narrator. In one of her writings, she talks about what she calls problem pregnancy. Pushed downstairs at 2 months pregnant, seeing military doctors. Started having very bad pain at 3 months, told it was pressure pain. Still no pelvic exam. Went to civilian doctor at 4.5 months. Given pelvic exam, revealed cracked pubic bone. At 5 months pregnant, had severe pain, could not hardly walk or turn over in bed. Could feel pubic bone rubbing. Doctor gave the following medications: Valium, Demerol, Darvon, and Darvocet. Also given some I don't remember the names of. Nothing stopped the pain. Hospitalized at 6 months with premature labor. Spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Shannon was born 3 weeks early. Susan's pain issues during her pregnancy, according to her daughters, led to a lifelong problem with prescription pain medication. Susan denied drinking or smoking during her pregnancy. She also later reported that during her pregnancy she was anemic, but she suffered such severe morning sickness that she couldn't keep down the iron tablets she was supposed to take. At some point, she says she was given Benedictine, which was a medication that was used to treat nausea and vomiting in pregnant women, although it was discontinued in 1983 after several lawsuits alleged it caused congenital malformations or birth defects. At about the 5-month mark, Susan later told a doctor, she began having severe contractions. According to her, doctors took numerous measures to prevent her from losing the baby. The contractions, Susan said, continued until delivery, and she said she was hospitalized off and on for about 6 weeks, which differs from the 2 weeks she mentioned in her written account. On October 2, 1980, Shannon Lee Cook was born. A doctor's report based on Susan's account of Shannon's birth later read, "Spontaneous labor progressed for approximately 5 hours, accompanied by the spontaneous rupture of membranes. An uncomplicated vertex delivery was performed." Although Susan had written that Shannon was 3 weeks early, she later told Dr. Jan Shaw of Herlong Pediatrics that her second daughter weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces when she was born at 34 weeks gestation, which would mean Shannon was the size of an average newborn despite being born a supposed 6 weeks early. As you can see, Susan's quote-unquote facts not lining up throughout the many tellings of her various tales will be a running theme throughout this episode, just like it has been over the previous 2 parts. Based on Susan's notations in Shannon's baby book and her accounts to doctors later on, her second daughter met her milestones normally. Shannon smiled and said her first word, "da," at 7 months old, sat alone between 8 and 9 months, crawled between 8 and 11 months, took her first step at 11 months, and walked alone by 14 months. Susan wrote that Shannon began saying single words at 2 and forming sentences at 3, by which time she was also potty trained. She rode a tricycle by age 3.5 and a bicycle by age 6. Susan also reported that Shannon had learned her colors by the age of 5 and learned to read in the 1st grade. According to Susan, despite meeting her milestones on time, Shannon was chronically ill. Susan claimed Shannon's health problems began at 2 weeks old, when she said Shannon was hospitalized for 2 days with bronchitis. In the same paragraph, Susan wrote, "Shannon would turn blue to the point of almost black on her feet and ankles, hands, vaginal and rectal areas. No explanation." In December of 1980, Susan claimed, 2-month-old Shannon was hospitalized for 6 days with acute gastroenteritis, otherwise known as the stomach flu, after experiencing vomiting and diarrhea for 2 weeks straight. Doctors switched Shannon to Prosobi, which is a soy-based baby formula, put her on Pedialyte, and gave her Donagel, a drug used to treat diarrhea. A month later, Shannon was back in the hospital, once again for acute gastroenteritis. The 3-month-old baby was still experiencing diarrhea and occasional vomiting, but she had also come down with a cold that turned into bronchitis. This time, they switched Shannon from Prosobi to Isomil, another soy formula, gave her more Pedialyte, and prescribed both Donagel and Donatol, another intestinal medication, made up of belladonna alkaloids and phenobarbital, which sounds pretty hardcore for an infant, so much so that pregnant women are cautioned against using it because of possible severe side effects for the baby. Susan was still reporting the inexplicable blue-black discoloration of the baby's extremities as well. Shannon was 5 months old when Susan and Doug called it quits, ending their relationship for good. For better or for worse, their daughters stayed in Susan's custody. By the time Shannon was 6.5 months old, Susan claimed the baby suffered from failure to thrive, because even when she did eat, Susan wrote, she would either throw it up or it would run through her. At Shannon's 6-month checkup, Susan claimed, she weighed 14 pounds. She was hospitalized again 2 weeks later with severe diarrhea and vomiting, and Susan wrote that even when they tried to give her Pedialyte, Shannon would not eat. IV was started, she would not move, kick, cry, or turn over. Within 2 days of this hospital admission, Susan claimed, her 14-pound baby now weighed 6 pounds and no longer had the strength to sit up or crawl. I'll go on record right now and tell you that is a bold-faced lie. Pictures of Shannon from that time frame show a perfectly healthy, happy little girl with appropriately chubby cheeks, sitting up and playing. If Shannon had weighed 6 pounds at nearly 7 months old, she would have looked like a tiny skeleton. During this hospitalization, Shannon went through many tests, including multiple sweat tests for cystic fibrosis. Susan said the results of these tests varied, although they all came back negative. Even so, the possible diagnosis of cystic fibrosis was a hill Susan seemed willing to die on for years to come. After that hospitalization, from which Susan claimed Shannon was sent home weighing 6 pounds, Shannon seemed to be doing better. According to Susan's written account, took her home, tried her on whole milk, she could not take it, tried 2% milk, forced her to eat 1 ounce every 3 hours and gradually increased the amount she would eat. She would go to sleep at 7 at night until I woke her up at 11 the next day. She finally started gaining weight and eating solids good. A couple things about that excerpt bothered me. For one thing, Susan making a reference to forcing her child to eat doesn't seem out of character for her at all, based on what we know about her so far. She flat out admitted to police that she forced baby Michael to eat dinner on the day of his death by shoving too much food in his mouth, so he had to swallow some of it. Shannon may have been the first of Susan's children to endure force feeding, but we know she wasn't the last. Also, I know it's possible for an infant to sleep 16 hours straight, but it's not exactly typical. Babies that age need about that much sleep in a 24-hour period, but it's usually split between night sleep and daytime naps. I can't help wondering if Shannon's long stretches of sleep had some kind of pharmaceutical cause. Either way, Shannon's reprieve from constant gastrointestinal distress was regrettably brief. By her first birthday on October 2, 1981, Susan wrote that Shannon's diarrhea had returned in full force. When she took Shannon to the pediatrician for her one-year checkup, according to Susan, the doctor was surprised to see her, saying he hadn't expected Shannon to live to see her first birthday. Susan's weirdly morbid entry in Shannon's baby book said that at 1 year old, Shannon was 29 inches tall and weighed 18 pounds 6 ounces, which would be a pretty miraculous growth spurt if Shannon really did weigh 6 pounds half a year before. Susan also wrote that the family celebrated Shannon's first birthday by giving her just a small party because you had been sick. You had cake and ice cream. The doctors said you wouldn't live to see your first birthday, but it's here and so are you. I love you so much and hope to be celebrating your second birthday with a better party. Shannon, Susan wrote, received clothes, a doll, books, and money as gifts. Under special interests and activities, Susan wrote, "You are curious about everything. You climb on everything. You are a beautiful little girl. You are small for your age, but considering you've been so sick, I'm just glad you're alive." Of course, the weirdness didn't stop with the baby book. In Susan's writings about Shannon's early childhood, a paragraph about November 1981 read, "Diarrhea off and on, occasional forceful vomiting. Vomiting comes on suddenly. She seems fine before and after. Her stomach swells very big and gets very hard. She has a lot of gas and pain. Smell of stools has always been very, very foul. She gets sick with colds and bronchitis a lot." I'll pause here for a quick sponsor break. Although I talked about Munchausen by proxy in a 4-part series last year from episodes 58 through 61, I think now's a good time to go over the definition of the term. Throughout that series on the topic, I frequently quoted Dr. Mark Feldman, clinical professor of psychiatry and adjunct professor of psychology at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, the author of more than 100 peer-reviewed articles in the professional literature on factitious disorders, an international expert in the field, and the author of 5 books on the subjects of factitious disorder, Munchausen syndrome, Munchausen by proxy, and malingering. His work has been featured in over 200 magazines and newspapers, and he has appeared on countless TV and radio programs talking about these complicated subjects. Needless to say, Dr. Feldman is one of the world's premier experts on the subject of factitious disorders. I was honored to speak with Dr. Feldman in episode 61. While I quoted him extensively throughout my series last year, this quote sums up his opinion on the subject. Dr. Feldman believes that Munchausen by proxy, also known as medical child abuse, is not a mental illness. It is a form of abuse, just like sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse. It's just a variant. Of course, mental illness is almost certainly a factor in almost every case involving MSBP, in which the perpetrators are often diagnosed with personality disorders or other mental conditions. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is not a psychiatric diagnosis in and of itself. This pattern of behavior actually falls under a psychiatric condition listed in the DSM-5 called factitious disorder imposed on another, or FDIA. I found an article in the April 2000 edition of the Primary Care Companion to the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry called Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy, a Clinical Vignette. In that article, 2 doctors and a therapist described the case of a 6-year-old boy whose mother was suspected of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. That article described MSBP as clearly a serious and potentially life-threatening situation for the victim, with a mortality rate approaching 10%. Treatment success rates for perpetrators are notoriously poor. Perpetrators of Munchausen syndrome by proxy are typically mothers, and the victims are usually their small children. The most common illness presentations are seizures, failure to thrive, vomiting and diarrhea, asthma and allergic reactions, and infections. These initial assaults are typically compounded by subsequent painful medical procedures performed in an effort to diagnose and treat what appears to be a most perplexing and elusive medical condition. By 18 months old, baby Shannon Cook was still suffering from frequently recurring vomiting, diarrhea, and other gastric symptoms. Susan reported Shannon woke up often at night, crying from the pain in her stomach, which was swollen and hard. She also said Shannon was very irritable and lethargic. In April of 1982, Shannon, by then weighing 28 pounds, was put on a liquid diet, although it didn't seem to have any effect on her symptoms. On June 3, 1982, Susan's divorce from Doug Cook was finalized. The same month, Shannon was hospitalized for 7 days with severe diarrhea and occasional vomiting. Just 2 months after weighing 28 pounds, she now apparently weighed 21 pounds. During this hospitalization, a sweat culture test was repeated twice, coming back both times with high results. For the record, high results on sweat tests, which can indicate cystic fibrosis, can easily be faked. One well-known Munchausen by proxy mother, Hope Ibarra, faked high sweat test results for her daughter using saline nasal spray. It's also worth mentioning that sodium poisoning, which is common in known cases of MSBP, can also return positive sweat chloride test results. Susan wrote of this hospitalization, "Sent home after 7 days. Would have been sooner, but nurse gave her apple juice, milk, and roast beef with green beans, and they had to start treating her all over again. The nurse forgot to read her chart. Referred to Portsmouth Naval Hospital, Dr. M.E. Swanson. Fort Eustis lost Shannon's medical record." That statement also stands out. It's extremely common for MSBP perpetrators to stop taking their child to a particular medical provider if they think the provider is suspicious of them, their child's illness, or their motivations. Altering or losing medical records makes it very easy to start over with a new provider. After moving to Missouri, Dee Dee Blanchard claimed medical records for her daughter, Gypsy Rose, were destroyed in Louisiana during Hurricane Katrina, which meant the new doctors she and Gypsy saw had to rely mostly on Dee Dee's word when it came to Gypsy's supposed health issues, and I think we all know how that turned out. In July of 1982, Shannon was seen by Dr. Swanson, who sent her to Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters in Norfolk for another sweat culture. Although the results came back as high normal, Shannon was by then regularly eating and drinking, and had even gained back 5 of the 7 pounds she'd lost in June. By August, Susan reported that Shannon was still eating well, but experiencing a lot of stomach swelling and gas, as well as occasional diarrhea and forceful vomiting. 2 additional sweat culture tests came back with results of first 64 and then 48. For context, a chloride level of 29 millimoles per liter means cystic fibrosis is unlikely. Between 30 and 59 means CF is possible and warrants further testing, and 60 or over means CF is likely. Susan also reported at this time that she was told Shannon had a diverticulum, which is basically a tiny pocket that forms in the lining of the colon. On September 11, 1982, one of Shannon's doctors told Susan that if the toddler didn't gain weight within 2 weeks, he would hospitalize her to find out why. They left the doctor's office with a prescription for Shannon's gas pain, but by that evening, Susan wrote, the baby's stomach was more swollen with gas than she'd ever seen, and the medicine did not help. Her stomach often sounds like a volcano erupting. She looks like she is 9 months pregnant and very overdue, very irritable, and days where you sometimes wonder if she will wake up long enough to eat, and no one can tell me what is wrong with her. Shannon was indeed hospitalized yet again within 2 weeks, this time for 3 days, although the doctor was still unable to come up with a definitive diagnosis for the poor little girl. By that time, Susan was dating the man who would become husband number 2, Thomas Anthony Kendzia Jr., who her daughters were already calling Daddy. Susan referred to Tom as such in the second birthday entry she wrote in Shannon's baby book. We gave you a small party at home since you just got out of the hospital the week before for 5 days. Mom, Daddy, Christy, Pop, Katie, and Kathy Price were here for your party. Your party favors are all Sesame Street. You had a white cake trimmed in blue with pink roses and green leaves, cupcakes, and ice cream. She listed all the gifts the baby received, including toys, clothes, and from her big sister, a music box that played Over the Rainbow. Finally, Susan noted, You love to see what you can get into. You are looking for trouble. But you are a very beautiful girl, and you make it clear that you're a daddy's girl. He has you spoiled rotten." Around the same time, Susan filled out the book's section titled Record of Childhood Illnesses. She wrote, "During 1981, you were hospitalized 6 times with what I still don't know. Neither do the doctors. You were hospitalized again the last week of June 1982. The doctors at first thought you had cystic fibrosis, but your doctor doesn't think that's what you have. At 2 years old, you weigh 24 pounds. Hospitalized again September 20th through 24th. Shannon underwent her first of many surgeries on February 7, 1983, at Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. The surgery, conducted by Dr. Nuss and Dr. Poley, was a Nissen fundoplication procedure. Probably not coincidentally, the first time I'd ever heard of this procedure was during my research for last year's Munchausen by proxy series. Garnet Spears also underwent this procedure thanks to the manipulations of his mother, Lacey. Nissen fundoplication is a surgical procedure in which the surgeon wraps the top part of the stomach around the bottom of the esophagus to prevent reflux and vomiting by reinforcing the lower esophageal sphincter. Susan told Shannon all her life that because Doug pushed her down the stairs while she was pregnant, Shannon was born with her stomach in her chest cavity, which ultimately led to the surgery at age 2. However, that condition, known as a pediatric diaphragmatic hernia, is usually a life-threatening birth defect that is treated immediately at birth with a stay in the NICU, a possible stint attached to a temporary heart and lung bypass machine called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO, and surgery to repair the hole in the diaphragm. There's no way Shannon would have been allowed out of the hospital without the condition being corrected, and her lungs would have been severely underdeveloped as well. It's much more likely that the constant forceful vomiting Shannon experienced caused her diaphragm to herniate. According to Susan, by the time Shannon underwent her first surgery, the lower valve in her esophagus no longer closed at all. After the first surgery, things seemed to calm down for Shannon, health-wise, at least for a while. 7 months after her initial surgery, Shannon was seen for the first time by Dr. Georgianne Hogerman, who diagnosed the almost 3-year-old with bronchitis, which was another recurrent condition Shannon experienced. Susan's baby book entry for Shannon's 3rd birthday stated that by that time, Shannon weighed 28 pounds. To celebrate, Susan wrote, "She gave you a Smurf party. Sarah Rusner came, and Emily and Sarah Sarver, and Katie Price, and Christy. You had a Smurf birthday cake, ice cream, and party bags. Lynn Peters helped." I've mentioned Lynn Peters and her husband Mike in the previous episodes. Lynn and Mike were Christy and Shannon's godparents and close friends of Susan's. Lynn was the friend who constantly reminded Susan that she needed to bond with her daughters, especially after little Shannon seemed to bond with Lynn instead. 3-year-old Shannon received multiple gifts for her birthday, including a rocking horse, a tricycle, a Care Bear, and a Cabbage Patch Boy doll. Under special interests and activities, Susan wrote, "You are very shy. You love to sing songs. Christy taught you to say your ABCs. You know most of your colors. You are a little behind in your speech, but you are catching up. You had surgery 2783 to fix your stomach, so you will be okay." 2 months later, on December 15, 1983, horrifically, Shannon was reportedly molested by an 8-year-old foster child who lived in the home. Although a rape kit was performed, Susan never bothered to tell Tom, Shannon's legal adoptive father, about the incident. Shannon's next several months were busy with various illnesses, from strep to pharyngitis, or sore throat, to viral syndrome, treated repeatedly with antibiotics. During one incident in March, the 3-year-old experienced a painful muscle spasm in her neck and shoulder, which caused her to fall. Although a chest and neck x-ray was performed, doctors couldn't pinpoint the reason for the spasm. Then, on August 27, 1984, Shannon was molested again, this time allegedly by a neighborhood boy named Austin and his brother Kevin. Susan later told a doctor the boy was 14, but at the time, she claimed he was 12. God only knows why boys this age had enough free access to her 3-year-old to sexually assault her. This part is horrible, so brace yourselves. During the assault, Austin and Kevin, who lived at the end of the street, took Shannon into a strip of bushes, removed some of her clothing, and proceeded to shove sticks inside the helpless little girl. When Shannon eventually got home, she was bleeding, Noticing this, Susan had the toddler sit down in front of her chair, where she pulled the sticks out of her daughter's orifices. The boy, Austin, was taken into custody a few days later as the suspected offender. Once again, Susan failed to tell Tom about their daughter's assault. She later told Christy and Shannon that Austin's brother, Kevin, was the reason she chose that name for their second adopted brother. Years later, Susan's daughters found amongst her belongings a birthday card to Shannon, signed in childish handwriting, "Love, Austin." You have to wonder why she would have kept a birthday card from a boy who allegedly sexually abused her own daughter. Whenever Shannon brought up the incident, because she had a very vivid memory of it, Susan told her it was just a bad dream. Only years later, when Shannon found reference to it in her medical records, did Susan admit it really happened. Shannon's 4th birthday party was Cabbage Patch themed and spent at home with a number of friends, including Laine and Mike Peters. Susan wrote that Shannon was 41 inches tall and weighed 34 pounds, and she wrote that Shannon's special interests and activities included going to pre-kindergarten, swinging, you love to eat, you love to play with the cats, and ride your tricycle. Soon, another strange and inexplicable medical issue began to plague 4-year-old Shannon. This time, she was diagnosed with leg pain that couldn't be eased by warm baths or heating pads. Doctors ran various blood tests, but all of Shannon's levels were found to be within normal limits, and no explanation for the pain was found. 1985 was another year that, for 4-year-old Shannon, was full of doctor visits, ER trips, and mysterious illnesses. In February, the day before the Kendzias found out about the first baby boy they would end up adopting, Shannon reportedly threw a fit and fell off the stairs, fracturing her ankle. Pharyngitis, or sore throat, was a recurring theme that year. Other diagnoses from just the first quarter of 1985 included conjunctivitis, or pink eye, gastroenteritis, chickenpox, constipation, and, despite her surgery 2 years before, recurring vomiting. A barium swallow test in April of 1985 showed that Shannon had developed a paraesophageal gastric herniation because the Nissen fundoplication site had slipped out of place. Once again, Shannon's stomach had slipped through the hiatus or opening in her diaphragm and become lodged in her chest cavity. The most likely reason for this was forceful vomiting, which the surgery was supposed to prevent. After this discovery, doctors planned to treat Shannon conservatively to see if her symptoms would subside, but unfortunately, they only got worse. The following month, Shannon was diagnosed with tonsillar exudate, which is fluid secreted by the tonsils in response to tonsil inflammation. On May 13, 1985, Shannon was admitted once again into Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, this time to undergo surgery to remove her tonsils and adenoids. Susan later told a pediatric neurologist that Shannon's adenoidectomy and tonsillectomy was complicated by some hemorrhaging afterward, although it is unknown if that's true or not. The same day as her surgery, Shannon's pediatric gastrointestinal surgeon, Dr. J. Rayner Poley, wrote a letter to her pediatrician, Dr. Georgianne Hogerman, including his diagnoses of recurrent gastroesophageal reflux, chronic fatigue, poor appetite, and possible hypoalbuminemia, which is a condition often associated with chronic disease. Shannon had also recently received a concerning borderline sweat test result that was normal when the test was repeated. Dr. Poley wrote that he checked Shannon again after not seeing her for over 2 years since her initial surgery. He said she did reasonably well after the procedure, but she was now experiencing increased abdominal bloating and swelling of the eyelids, which Susan told him happened together about 90% of the time. Susan reported her daughter's stools were either loose or constipated and green, seedy, and rarely brown. Dr. Poley wrote that 4.5-year-old Shannon also complained of abdominal and substernal pain and experienced hiccuping and burping as well as frequent bronchitis. He said Shannon's appetite was variable. She would rather drink than eat, and Susan felt it was probably due to her abdominal pain. She said Shannon was not active because she was tired all the time and was constantly thirsty, getting up twice in the night to use the bathroom and even sometimes wetting her pants. In the letter, Dr. Poley mentioned that Susan was still concerned about the possibility of cystic fibrosis. To me, this insinuates that CF was something that came up frequently and most likely at Susan's insistence. Susan's friend Lynn Peters, who at the time had a young family member with cystic fibrosis, later recalled that Susan used to be oddly curious about the subject, asking her question after question about her relative's condition. Dr. Poley recommended running a full battery of tests on Shannon, including a repeat upper GI and a repeat sweat test with a chest X-ray and a sinus X-ray. He also wanted a test done to measure exocrine pancreatic function, adding, "Ms. Kendzia feels more comfortable if these tests are done while the child is admitted to Children's Hospital, and I hope you agree to this plan. Admission is tentatively set for 5/20/85. In a follow-up letter on June 19, 1985, from Dr. Poley to Dr. Hogerman, the surgeon wrote that Shannon was diagnosed with a rectal polyp, which Dr. Wahlberg attempted to snare and cauterize the stalk. However, during the procedure, the polyp apparently sloughed off by itself without any bleeding, and was not retrieved but later passed on its own. Although the polyp wasn't tested by the pathology lab, Dr. Poley was 99% sure it was a juvenile, retention-type polyp, which is a benign colonic tumor that usually presents as rectal bleeding. Dr. Poley told Dr. Hogerman that Shannon's repeat sweat test was normal, putting the question of cystic fibrosis to rest. He added that her borderline hypoalbuminemia was present on a nutritional basis and needed to be followed, although he could not determine whether it had anything to do with her esophageal symptoms. Dr. Poley felt that Shannon's paraesophageal hernia would need to be repaired, saying Dr. Nuss or Dr. Wahlberg would be in contact with Dr. Hogerman and with the Kendzia family. The same month, Dr. Hogerman sent Shannon's records to Dr. Douglas Gregory, a pediatrician in Portsmouth, Virginia. It's not clear why the Kendzias were changing doctors, but again, that is a very common practice seen in cases of Munchausen by proxy. 2 months later, the first of Susan's 2 adopted sons, Michael Thomas Kendzia, died at just 9 months of age. I'll pause here for another word from my sponsors. Susan's daughters clearly remember their mother having an entire cabinet full of bottles of ipecac syrup. Virginia law required in-home daycare providers to keep a single bottle of ipecac on hand, but certainly not dozens of bottles. Ipecac syrup, which is made from the roots of the ipecacuana plant, used to be used to induce vomiting in children who had ingested poison, but because it is ineffective in removing all poison from the stomach, and because it is a poison in and of itself, it is no longer recommended to be kept in the home and rarely recommended to use at all. If used regularly, ipecac can cause heart problems such as cardiomyopathy or even death. I mention Susan's ipecac syrup collection because Shannon's many bizarre medical problems share an eerie overlap with the symptoms of regular use of or poisoning by ipecac. Some of those symptoms include diarrhea, a fast or irregular heartbeat, nausea or vomiting that may continue for over 30 minutes, stomach cramps or pain, trouble breathing, low blood pressure, unusual tiredness or lethargy, muscle weakness, aching, and stiffness, especially in the muscles of the neck, arms, and legs, edema or swelling, as well as electrolyte disturbances and dehydration, fever, gastritis or inflammation of the stomach lining, and colitis or chronic inflammation of the inner lining of the colon. I came across a study from the June 1985 issue of Pediatrics called Non-Emetic Effects of Ipecac Syrup. In that study, researchers determined the after effects of using ipecac syrup at home to induce vomiting, also known as emesis. The study found that ipecac-induced emesis can produce diarrhea and lethargy. I'm sure you'll recall that diarrhea was one of Shannon's most often reported symptoms, and that Susan frequently wrote about and reported that her daughter slept an unusual amount of the time. I had to wonder, though, if Shannon was experiencing ipecac poisoning during her childhood, how that wouldn't have been discovered in the countless blood tests doctors ran over the years. As it turns out, because ipecac was commonly used, it was extremely rare that toxicology labs would look for or even report the presence of ipecac in routine blood screens. I'm not saying Shannon was definitely poisoned with ipecac syrup starting nearly from birth. I'm just saying the coincidences make it a very plausible theory. On November 13, 1985, 2.5 years after her first surgery and partway into her kindergarten year, Shannon underwent a second Nissen fundoplication procedure to repair the damage caused by her constant forceful vomiting. After she was released from the hospital this time, Shannon started having dysphagia, or difficulty swallowing, but a subsequent barium swallow test showed no leakage at the surgery site. Dr. Donald Nuss wrote a letter on December 6th referring Shannon back to Dr. Gregory, saying he encouraged Susan to keep Shannon on soft foods and make sure she sits upright when she eats to minimize her trouble swallowing. As far as Shannon's health went, for the first half of 1986, things seemed fairly quiet. During this time, Susan was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment, and very quickly after she was released, she and her husband, Tom, adopted a second baby, 2-month-old Kevin Ryan Kendzia. After Kevin's suspicious death on May 25, 1986, Susan may have turned her attention back to Shannon, at least temporarily. In June, Shannon was taken to the doctor with a bad cough and a temperature of 106 degrees Fahrenheit, or 41 degrees Celsius. She was diagnosed with bronchitis or early pneumonia and prescribed several medications to treat her condition. After Susan's arrest on July 7, 1986, 7-year-old Christy and 5-year-old Shannon were sent to South Carolina to live with Susan's parents, Marion and Betty Stevenson. Instead of living with their Pawpaw and Mimi, however, within 2 weeks of being sent to South Carolina, the girls ended up in the home of their Aunt Renee, Susan's sister, and her 3 children, 10-year-old Brian, 8-year-old Corey, and 7-year-old Rebecca. They lived in a tiny 3-bedroom house on Bowes Avenue in Rock Hill. Brian was Shannon's hero. He was kind to her, treated her well, and even let her hang out with him in his room. Corey, however, treated Shannon very differently. Behind the house was an old tin building with sliding doors. The building, which was like a large utility shed, was rusty and falling apart, and toward the back of the building was a low countertop with space behind it to stand, which resembled a bar but probably functioned as a workbench of sorts. It was solid, so you couldn't see underneath it, which made the area behind it very private. Soon after the girls came to live with Renee's family, Corey lured Shannon behind the workbench to play. After staring at the 5-year-old for an unsettling length of time, Corey demanded, "Let me see." Shannon didn't know what he meant, so Corey made his cousin take her clothes off and molested her for the first of what would be countless times. One day, Renee found Corey touching Shannon in the shed. She brought her son and her niece inside the house, where, in her bedroom, she forced them to take off their clothes and stare at each other's naked bodies. She then began smacking Shannon, punishing the 5-year-old for what her son did, screaming at Shannon that if she ever did that again, Renee would tell her mother. Shannon felt a deep sense of shame over the incident and began believing she had done something wrong. Even though she had been sexually abused twice as a toddler, Shannon had no idea what her cousin was doing to her or what it meant. Susan, who never told Tom about their daughter being molested, had also never educated her daughter about sex or bad touching or standing up for herself. Because of this, the molestation went on for years. Corey took to sneaking into wherever Shannon was sleeping to touch her during the night. Eventually, he graduated from just touching to actually raping his younger cousin. During Susan's pretrial process, she occasionally visited her children in South Carolina and even brought Shannon back to Virginia for a few doctor's appointments, one of which was documented in a letter from Dr. Poley to Dr. Philip Thomason, a pediatric specialist in Portsmouth. In his letter, Dr. Poley explained that he examined Shannon on August 15, 1986, and that she had done well after her second Nissen fundoplication surgery until the end of May 1986, at which point she reportedly began to complain again about abdominal pain, abdominal distension, increased intestinal gas, and loose, very malodorous stools, 1 to 3 times per day. The pains are felt in the epigastric area. Vomiting occurred 1 time. The doctor continued, "The child was at the grandparents' house and stayed there until a week ago for family reasons. It is my understanding that the child will soon go back to the grandparents' residence again. The grandparents live in South Carolina. Their water source is city water. However, the child was exposed to well water at mother's sister's place, which is also in South Carolina. No stool exams have been done. Mother reported that the child drinks a great deal, but I think she is just compensating for water losses in her stool. She hiccups and burps a lot, but after surgery has good height and weight acceleration." Dr. Poley noted that Shannon frequently suffered from colds or possible allergies, and was also often itchy, although he wasn't sure if she might have mild eczema. He mentioned, "She has difficulty going to sleep, but there are certain emotional factors involved here." I'm sure he was talking about her brother's deaths and probably her mother's arrest. If only Dr. Poley knew about the nightly horrors Shannon was exposed to at the hands of her young cousin. He described Shannon as a blonde, cooperative child who had allergic shiners, which are dark circles under the eyes that look like black eyes but are caused by sinus blockages due to allergies. He also described a bruise on Shannon's left thigh, which he said was caused because apparently she fell while running at the beach and hit an object. The doctor requested stool samples be tested at a local hospital. He couldn't rule out giardiasis, a diarrheal disease caused by a parasite, but he put her on a sucrose-restricted diet and prescribed an antibiotic in case she suffered from a so-called chronic, nonspecific diarrhea. He also prescribed Donatol again, thinking part of her abdominal pain might be due to a vasomotor disorder, which is the constriction or dilation of the blood vessels. 3 days after that visit, a note in Shannon's medical file described her suffering from a 100.4-degree fever and experiencing stomach cramps despite not eating or drinking for 3 days. Despite a number of tests, including an upper GI X-ray, yet again, a diagnosis was not found. I don't know about you, but I find it very curious that Shannon only seemed to get sick when she was in the company of her mother. That fall, Shannon began attending first grade in South Carolina. At the end of September, Susan visited her girls in Rock Hill, where she and her family held an early birthday party for Shannon's 6th birthday. She turned 6 on October 2, 1986. Once Susan had been acquitted in Michael's murder and her charge for Kevin's murder had been dropped, she and Tom broke up, at which point Susan joined her daughters in South Carolina, moving the 3 of them into their own home in Rock Hill. Shannon did well in first grade, where her teacher, Mrs. Yon, had only good things to say about her in her report card. However, on a state-mandated basic skills assessment in April of 1987, Shannon scored below the state standard in reading and math. Based on her scores on the assessment, she was held back to repeat the first grade. It's hard to imagine all of the trauma Shannon had been through had nothing to do with this. A song written by 6-year-old Shannon gives a little window into some of that trauma. The song, which she titled "Jesus Loves You, So Why Don't You Love Him," is written in childish printing and riddled with adorable misspellings. There's only one verse, but it hits hard. The lyrics read, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus, take the children into your heart with care, because some mothers and fathers do not care about their children, so please take them into your heart with care." Just to add insult to injury, or injury to insult in this case, the same month Shannon learned she would be repeating first grade, the poor girl also sustained a broken wrist on her babysitter's trampoline. In September of 1987, Shannon started first grade for the second time. Her teacher, Ms. Williams, seemed very pleased with Shannon's performance at the beginning, but as the year wore on, her comments on Shannon's report card reflected more and more concern. Shannon had some difficulty reading, writing, and focusing on her work. In the meantime, Susan had been quite busy handwriting a lengthy manuscript, which she had nauseatingly titled "Guilty of Love." In February of 1988, she sent a letter to Oprah Winfrey about the possibility of publishing the book, saying the book was about her experience of being falsely accused of the murders of my 2 adopted biracial sons. The book deals with all of the problems we had adopting biracial children, their deaths, its effect on our life, the investigation, and the arrest and the trial. In her letter, Susan somewhat disingenuously wrote that she was acquitted on December 19, 1986, not mentioning that the second murder count was never tried. Susan dedicated the book to her boyfriend, her daughters, her parents, her lawyers and their secretaries, and a few others. Very curiously, Michael and Kevin were not mentioned on the dedication page. Ultimately, she received a response saying that Oprah wasn't interested. The boyfriend I mentioned a moment ago was 34-year-old John Lee, an ex-con, alcoholic, and heroin addict who had recently been released from prison. The incident that put him there took place when John was followed to his home in Alaska by a police officer. John, who was on PCP and didn't realize the individual following him was a cop, shot the police officer in his driveway. After John's parole, he made his way to South Carolina, where he lived for a short time with some people who happened to be friends of Susan Kendzia. John and Susan met and began a relationship, and by March of 1988, John had moved in with Susan and her 2 daughters. The same month, Susan gave permission for the Special Services Center of Rock Hill School District No. 3 to perform a psychological evaluation of 7-year-old Shannon. In a letter to Susan, school psychologist Betty Summers wrote, "Shannon is experiencing no significant academic or behavioral problems at school. She is also demonstrating no hyperactivity." It's not clear what led to the psychological evaluation, although Susan had long complained about Shannon's behavior, claiming she was stubborn, difficult, and prone to cause trouble. Susan had previously described Shannon as trying, saying she would scream if you tell her not to do something. You don't have to spank her, but if you tell her to eat, if it is something she doesn't want to eat, she will scream at the top of her lungs. That's Shannon. That's just the way she is. Again, I can't imagine this child's long-term trauma had nothing to do with that. Susan was apparently not satisfied with the results of the school district's psychological evaluation. Shannon passed the first grade in June of 1988, and 2 months later, on August 5th, Susan and John took her on a car ride, telling her they were going to play somewhere new. When they arrived at their destination, they took Shannon inside. While she was distracted, Susan and John simply left Shannon there without a word. The place turned out to be Cedar Springs Psychiatric Hospital in Pineville, North Carolina. Shannon, who again was just 7 years old, was hospitalized there for 2 months under the supervision of Dr. Joseph Horacek. Medical records later stated that Shannon was hospitalized for aggressive behavior and severe emotional problems. She was aware that her 2 foster infant brothers died of uncertain causes and that her mother had been blamed for each. She became tearful and very upset when describing this. Psychological testing revealed a tense, anxious, hypervigilant youngster with a great deal of internal rage attributable to numerous losses, separation, and sexual abuse. She refused to furnish any details of the sexual abuse, but admitted that something happened which both angered and embarrassed her. It became apparent that Shannon lacked social skills, poor impulse control, was oppositional and reluctant to establish close interpersonal ties with anyone. Reality testing was felt to be grossly intact, and she coped poorly with emotional stress. Intellectually, she functions in the high average to superior range. The psychologist felt that Shannon was quite depressed, possibly indicating dysthymia or a major depression. She and her family did receive psychotherapy during her stay there. The family did not continue psychotherapy after her discharge, secondary to difficulty with traffic and getting back and forth to Charlotte. During that hospitalization, if Shannon acted up, she would be locked up alone in a white room with nothing but a mattress on the floor and a tiny observation window in the door. This is typically known as a quiet room or a seclusion room, which is supposed to help the child reduce aggressive or disruptive behaviors and calm down enough to return to the ward. Although I understand the necessity for these rooms, it's hard not to liken time spent there to solitary confinement. After Shannon was released from her hospital stay, Susan married John Lee on October 18, 1988. Because her middle name is Lee, the bride's legal name after the marriage was Susan Lee Lee. Both Christy and Shannon kept the last name of their legal adoptive father, Tom Kendzia. Shannon continued to experience health issues throughout her second grade year. On March 10, 1989, Shannon had a neurologic evaluation by Dr. Jan Shaw, a pediatric and adolescent neurology specialist at the Herlong Pediatric Center in Rock Hill, who noted that Susan reported Shannon suffered daily headaches that increased in frequency over the previous 2 months. Dr. Shaw's report mentioned that Shannon's older sister, Christy, had been diagnosed with ADHD and also suffered some emotional and behavioral problems, and that she was taking some type of psychostimulant medication. Much of Shannon's history, as listed in the report, came from what Susan told Dr. Shaw, who wrote that Shannon was presently a second-grade student at Ebenport School in Ms. Wistonen's class. Of primary concern at this time is Shannon's academic underachievement and difficulty in maintaining her attention in the classroom, with particular concerns regarding her distractibility, her attention span, and her failure to finish work. Ms. Wistonen expresses considerable concerns regarding her inattention, impulsivity, and poor peer interactions. She expresses considerable concerns regarding components of the attention deficit disorder and aggressiveness. Shannon has particular problems with inattentiveness, easy distractibility, temper outbursts, and is defiant. Ms. Wistonen reports that Shannon is a bright child who does not work up to her ability. She is extremely disorganized and careless with her work and work habits. Her behavior is extremely erratic in that she is easy to anger and will assume no responsibility for being wrong. She gets along well with her peers as long as they don't cross her or make her mad. Ms. Wistenant reports that Shannon is like two little girls in one. She can be very sweet and gentle one moment, and then completely hostile and disruptive the next. This may change with the events of the day or minute. The mother's questionnaire reveals particular concerns regarding her restlessness, denying her mistakes and blaming others, rapid mood changes, and easy frustration. The stepfather has similar concerns as provided by the mother. Susan apparently told Dr. Shaw as part of the family history that she and Tom separated in the summer of 1986 and legally separated in January of 1987, but based on her phone calls with her attorney, Ken Usner, and other sources, Susan was with Tom throughout her entire trial, only separating once the second murder charge was dropped. Susan also told the doctor that Christy and Shannon hadn't seen their adoptive father, Tom, since their separation, but that's blatantly not true either. There are too many of these seemingly insignificant inconsistencies to count throughout all of the documentation I've seen while researching this miniseries, and although they might be unimportant on a one-by-one basis, added up, they really paint a picture of Susan's ability to lie without compunction whenever the whim strikes. In the evaluation, Dr. Shaw noted that Shannon was withdrawn, reluctant to answer questions, and exhibited poor eye contact, and she didn't warm much, if at all, during the visit. Dr. Shaw ended the letter saying that while she believed Shannon had some attention problems in the classroom, she was especially concerned about the 8-year-old's ongoing depression. She prescribed imipramine for both attention problems and ongoing depression. She does need ongoing psychological help, but the family does not want to return to Charlotte for this service. I will refer them to Dr. Jim Phillips for ongoing psychological therapy. This will need to be administered to both the child and her family. The family never did follow up with therapy. Dr. Shaw also mentioned that she requested Shannon's medical records from Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters in Virginia, but she received a response that they had no record of a patient named Shannon Kendzia. This is extremely strange considering Shannon's multiple surgeries, treatments, and tests performed at the hospital. One has to wonder how the hospital could have misplaced a child's entire medical record. I'll pause here for one last sponsor break. In early June of 1989, the girls went to Virginia for summer visitation with their adoptive father, Tom, which would end up being the last visit they ever had with him. After Shannon got into an argument with Tom's wife, who ended up putting her hands on the 8-year-old and locking her in the upstairs bathroom, Susan came to pick Shannon up early, leaving Christy with her father. Within a day or two, Shannon would be hospitalized yet again. On the morning of June 16, 1989, Dr. Lentz at the Piedmont Medical Center saw Shannon, whose exam that day was normal. She threw up once that day, but later in the afternoon and into the evening, she began throwing up profusely, doubled over with abdominal pain and cramping. She was taken to the emergency room, where her blood pressure was measured at 110/70, and her pulse was measured at 120 beats per minute while she lay flat. During a tilt table test, which is performed to evaluate the cause of lightheadedness, dizziness, or fainting, Shannon's blood pressure dropped to 90/72, and her pulse shot up to 150 beats per minute. It might bear mentioning again that chronic use of ipecac syrup can cause heart damage, low blood pressure, and irregular heartbeat. X-rays showed some air and bloating in the colon, but it did not appear Shannon had torn or otherwise dislocated her Nissen fundoplication. Based on her clinical exam, Shannon appeared dehydrated, although lab tests did not bear out that result. Nonetheless, because of her clinical presentation, Shannon was admitted to the hospital late that evening for IV fluids, further evaluation, and control of her nausea and vomiting. A nasogastric tube was inserted through the nose into the stomach to facilitate decompression of her bloated abdominal area. Shannon was discharged 3 days later after a barium swallow test showed there was no problem with her surgical site. Once again, doctors had no explanation for her gastric issues. The same month, the Lee household saw the addition of 2 more family members when John Lee's sons, 9-year-old John Christopher and 7.5-year-old Levi, who had lived till that point with their mother in Alaska, came to live with their father and his wife. For a time, Susan worked as a bookkeeper for the Flint Hill Baptist Church in Fort Mills, South Carolina, where she soon proved that her dishonesty apparently did not start and stop with the various stories she told Shannon's medical providers. That summer, Susan was fired from her job, and on August 31, 1989, she was arrested on a charge of breach of trust with fraudulent intent. In South Carolina, that charge equates to what some other states call embezzlement, which is when someone entrusted with someone else's money uses that money for their own personal benefit. The charge was ultimately nol prost, or dismissed without prejudice, several months later, but that wouldn't be the last Susan would hear of it. Meanwhile, in the fall of 1989, the Lee family moved into a house on Woodstock Drive in Rock Hill. The house was in the middle of the woods near a creek, and there was a ton of area for the kids to play, not to mention hiding places. Within days of the family moving in, Susan's sister, Renee, called and asked Susan to take Corey, saying he was causing problems at home and she couldn't deal with him. Whether or not Susan knew that Corey had been raping her younger daughter for years is hard to say. Either way, she agreed to let her nephew move in, giving him direct access to Shannon. During the day, if the kids weren't in school and it was nice enough outside, Susan would kick them out of the house to play. On a regular basis, Corey, who was nearly 12, lured almost 9-year-old Shannon into the woods alone and sexually assaulted her. The audacity of this child to do this with his 3 other cousins running around is astounding, but he had been getting away with it so long it's really not that surprising. Inside the house, because there were 7 people living there, it was hard for anyone to keep a close eye on anyone else. When everyone was busy and distracted, Corey pulled Shannon into a closet and raped her, sometimes multiple times per day, using rubber gloves as condoms. These daily assaults continued for the next 3 years, and even then, Corey's abuse didn't stop altogether. One day during Shannon's 3rd grade year, she was asked to come up to the chalkboard. When she stood from her desk, Shannon collapsed to the floor in severe pain. Because she wasn't running a fever, the office staff told her to go back to class, but before long, they called Susan to pick her up. Before the end of the day, Shannon ended up having her appendix removed. How exciting this must have been for Susan, her daughter in the hospital, and she didn't even have to lift a finger to make it happen. On June 12, 1990, Susan's charge of breach of trust with fraudulent intent reared its head again. For whatever reason, the charge was once again dismissed without prejudice within months. In October of 1990, John Lee got permanent legal custody of his sons. The custody paperwork states that this was due to an agreement between John and the boys' mother, although Susan later insisted the woman had dumped the boys on them. Regardless of the reason, those boys would have been far better off staying with their mother, but unfortunately, that's not the way things turned out. There is so much to Shannon's story that I can't fit it all into one episode. Next week, I'll tell you more about Shannon's ongoing and worsening medical problems, the terminal diagnosis her mother made her believe for 8 years, and how the years of trauma she endured under her mother's roof led her down an incredibly dark and self-destructive path.
I was being groomed to die, not groomed to live.
That's it for part 3. Join me next week for part 4. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. To help support the show, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod. or ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter and TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Laine. All music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.